A sudden operation that shook a nation. In the pre-dawn hours of Saturday, residents of Venezuela's capital awoke to a series of thunderous blasts, the low rumble of aircraft overhead, and rapidly spreading rumors that the country was experiencing one of the most consequential military actions in its modern history. According to official statements released hours later in the United States, American forces had executed what was described as a large-scale operation within Venezuelan territory, an operation that allegedly resulted in the detention and removal of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and his wife. The announcement, made directly by President Donald Trump through social media, immediately triggered shockwaves across diplomatic, political, and media landscapes worldwide. If confirmed in full, the operation would represent one of the most dramatic foreign interventions in the Western Hemisphere in decades. Explosions across Caracas and military installations hit. Multiple explosions were reported across Caracas shortly after 2 a.m. local time. Witnesses described loud detonations, shaking buildings, and visible fires near key government and military zones. Low-flying helicopters and aircraft were seen maneuvering over the city, prompting widespread speculation even before official confirmation emerged. Among the sites reportedly affected was Fuerte Tuna, Venezuela's largest and most strategically important military complex. Fires were visible from several districts, and images circulating online showed plumes of smoke rising into the night sky. Venezuelan authorities later acknowledged that both civilian and military areas in Caracas, as well as surrounding states including Miranda, Aragua, and La Guaira, were impacted. U.S. confirms detention of Venezuelan leadership. Hours after the explosions, President Trump stated that the operation had concluded successfully, and both Nicolás Maduro and his wife had been taken into custody and removed from Venezuela. According to Trump, the mission was conducted in coordination with U.S. law enforcement agencies and military units, though operational specifics were not immediately disclosed. The president announced that a formal briefing would take place later that morning at Mar-a-Lago, signaling that additional details would follow. No independent verification of Maduro's location or condition was immediately available at the time of the announcement. Specialized aviation units reportedly involved. Defense analysts noted that the helicopters observed over Caracas were consistent with aircraft operated by the U.S. Army's 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, commonly referred to as the Night Stalkers. This elite unit specializes in clandestine nighttime missions and has been deployed in numerous high-risk operations worldwide. While U.S. officials did not publicly confirm unit participation, the aircraft type and flight patterns reported by witnesses strongly suggested the involvement of specialized forces trained for rapid insertion and extraction missions. Caracas responds, accusations of aggression and imperialism. Venezuela's government issued a sharply worded statement condemning the operation as an unlawful act of aggression. Officials characterized the strikes as a direct attack on national sovereignty and accused Washington of attempting to impose political change through force. The statement alleged that the true motive behind the operation was control over Venezuela's natural resources, particularly oil and mineral reserves. Government representatives emphasized that Venezuela's leadership and population would resist what they described as foreign intervention, asserting that the country's independence and political system would not be dismantled by external pressure. Claims of regime change rejected. In its response, the Venezuelan government rejected any legitimacy to the operation, framing it as part of a long-standing campaign to destabilize the country. Officials argued that previous efforts to weaken the government through sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and economic pressure had failed, and that military force would fare no better. The statement warned that attempts to impose a new political order through violence would deepen regional instability and undermine international law. Reaction from Washington, a turning point. Senior U.S. officials reacted swiftly to the president's announcement. Deputy Secretary of State Christopher Landau described the moment as transformative, suggesting that Venezuela was entering a new chapter after years of political and humanitarian crisis. In public remarks posted online, Landau declared that accountability would now follow for alleged crimes attributed to Maduro's government, signaling a potential shift in U.S. policy from pressure to enforcement. Congressional concerns over legal authority. Not all reactions in the United States were celebratory. Several lawmakers raised immediate questions regarding the constitutional and legal basis for the operation. Senator Mike Lee of Utah publicly questioned whether the action had been authorized by Congress or justified under existing war powers frameworks. The absence of a formal declaration of war or publicly announced authorization for the use of military force reignited debate over executive authority and the limits of presidential power in conducting overseas military operations. Background: pressure campaign and drug trafficking allegations. The operation followed months of escalating U.S. military and law enforcement activity in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific, where American forces had intensified efforts to intercept vessels suspected of drug trafficking.
U.S. officials have long accused elements of the Venezuelan government of facilitating narcotics operations, allegations that Caracas has consistently denied. Just days before the reported strike, Maduro had publicly stated that his government was open to negotiations with Washington on counter-narcotics cooperation and energy investment, a signal that some observers interpreted as an attempt to ease mounting pressure. Maduro's overtures and missed diplomacy. In a pre-recorded television interview aired earlier in the week, Maduro expressed willingness to engage in talks with the United States on drug enforcement and oil development. He argued that cooperation, rather than confrontation, would benefit both nations and regional stability. Those comments, now viewed through the lens of the military operation, have raised questions about whether diplomatic channels were still active or had already collapsed prior to Saturday's events. A region on alert, immediate international reactions. As dawn broke across the Western Hemisphere, governments throughout Latin America scrambled to assess the implications of the reported U.S. military operation in Venezuela. Emergency meetings were convened in multiple capitals, as leaders weighed the possibility that the sudden removal of a sitting head of state, if confirmed, could destabilize an already fragile regional balance. Neighboring countries with close geographic and economic ties to Venezuela, including Colombia, Brazil, and several Caribbean nations, issued cautious statements urging restraint and calling for verified information. Many governments emphasized the need to avoid escalation while reiterating commitments to sovereignty and international law. At the Organization of American States, OAS, diplomatic representatives reportedly sought an emergency session to discuss the situation. Several member states expressed concern that the precedent of unilateral military action could undermine regional mechanisms designed to resolve political crises through negotiation and multilateral pressure.
As dawn broke across the Western Hemisphere, governments throughout Latin America scrambled to assess the implications of the reported U.S. military operation in Venezuela. Emergency meetings were convened in multiple capitals as leaders weighed the possibility that the sudden removal of a sitting head of state, if confirmed, could destabilize an already fragile regional balance. Neighboring countries with close geographic and economic ties to Venezuela, including Colombia, Brazil, and several Caribbean nations, issued cautious statements urging restraint and calling for verified information. Many governments emphasized the need to avoid escalation while reiterating commitments to sovereignty and international law. At the Organization of American States, OAS, diplomatic representatives reportedly sought an emergency session to discuss the situation. Several member states expressed concern that the precedent of unilateral military action could undermine regional mechanisms designed to resolve political crises through negotiation and multilateral pressure. Europe and the global community respond. European leaders reacted with a mix of caution and unease. Officials from the European Union emphasized the importance of transparency and legal justification, urging all parties to respect international norms. While some European governments have been openly critical of Maduro's leadership in recent years, they stopped short of endorsing the use of force, instead calling for clarity regarding the legal framework under which the operation was conducted. In Asia, reactions were similarly restrained. China and Russia, both of which have long-standing political and economic relationships with Venezuela, were closely monitoring developments. Analysts noted that Moscow and Beijing have historically opposed regime change operations, particularly those led by Western powers, and warned that the incident could further strain already tense global relations. Aviation shutdown, Venezuelan airspace sealed. Within hours of the reported operation, aviation authorities acted swiftly to mitigate risk. The U.S. Federal Aviation Administration issued an emergency notice prohibiting all American aircraft from operating within Venezuelan airspace at any altitude. The directive applied to commercial airlines, cargo operators, and private flights alike. This move effectively isolated Venezuela from U.S.-linked air traffic and prompted several international carriers to reroute flights that would normally pass over or near Venezuelan territory. Aviation experts describe the restriction as a standard but serious precaution, typically associated with active or uncertain military environments. Air traffic data showed immediate changes across the Caribbean basin, with aircraft diverting northward or eastward to avoid Venezuelan skies. The disruption underscored how quickly a regional conflict can ripple outward into global transportation networks. U.S. Embassy warnings and citizen safety. Amid the uncertainty, the U.S. Embassy in Bogotá issued a renewed warning advising American citizens not to travel to Venezuela under any circumstances. For those already in the country, guidance emphasized remaining indoors, avoiding public gatherings, and monitoring official updates. The advisory reiterated long-standing concerns about safety and the absence of consular support, noting that U.S. diplomatic operations in Caracas have been suspended since 2019. With no functioning embassy on the ground, American citizens in Venezuela face significant challenges in accessing assistance during emergencies. Other nations followed suit, with several issuing similar travel warnings or advising their nationals to delay travel until the situation became clearer. Regional security implications. Security analysts warned that the operation could have far-reaching consequences beyond Venezuela's borders.
The country's political instability has already contributed to one of the largest migration crises in the region's history, with millions fleeing economic hardship over the past decade. Experts caution that renewed conflict or power vacuums could trigger additional displacement, placing strain on neighboring countries already grappling with refugee inflows. Border security agencies in Colombia and Brazil reportedly increased monitoring efforts in anticipation of potential population movements. There were also concerns about the response of armed groups operating within or near Venezuelan territory. Analysts noted that uncertainty at the top of the political hierarchy can embolden non-state actors, criminal networks, and paramilitary organizations seeking to exploit instability. Energy markets react to uncertainty. Global energy markets reacted immediately to the news. Venezuela, despite years of declining production, remains home to some of the world's largest proven oil reserves. Any disruption to its output or uncertainty surrounding control of its energy sector has the potential to influence oil prices. Traders monitor developments closely, factoring in the possibility of sanctions changes, shifts in export policy, or disruptions to infrastructure. Energy analysts emphasize that even symbolic actions, such as uncertainty over leadership or governance, can affect investor confidence and long-term production planning. Companies with historical or ongoing interests in Venezuelan oil fields, including international firms operating under special licenses, faced renewed questions about regulatory stability and contract enforcement. Legal and constitutional questions in the United States. Back in Washington, the operation reignited a long-standing debate over presidential authority to deploy military force abroad. Legal scholars and lawmakers examined whether existing statutes, including counter-narcotic authorities or national security provisions, could justify such an action without explicit congressional approval. Some members of Congress called for classified briefings, seeking clarity on the intelligence used to support the operation and the scope of U.S. involvement. Others warned that bypassing legislative authorization could set a troubling precedent, regardless of one's views on Venezuela's leadership. The discussion highlighted the tension between executive flexibility in responding to perceived threats and the constitutional role of Congress in authorizing military action. Competing narratives and information warfare. As the story unfolded, competing narratives emerged across state media, social platforms, and international outlets. Venezuelan government channels framed the operation as foreign aggression designed to seize resources, while U.S. officials emphasized accountability, security, and alleged criminal activity. Disinformation experts warned that the information environment surrounding the event was highly volatile. Conflicting reports, unverified claims, and rapidly spreading videos made it difficult for observers to separate confirmed facts from speculation. Analysts stressed the importance of independent verification, noting that early reports during fast-moving crises are often incomplete or inaccurate. What comes next? A critical juncture. By Saturday afternoon, one reality was clear. The operation marked a critical turning point in U.S.-Venezuela relations and had introduced a new level of uncertainty into regional geopolitics. Whether the event would lead to de-escalation, prolonged instability, or a reconfiguration of political power in Venezuela remained unknown. Diplomats, investors, humanitarian organizations, and ordinary citizens alike awaited further information, aware that decisions made in the coming days could shape the region's trajectory for years to come.